particular, member of that group that I related a lot to on a myriad of levels. So my number 10 is a tie between Nirvana, Seattle's Nirvana, and Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath for me, when I was first getting into, I was like 4th, 5th grade, I was getting into hard rock and eventually heavy metal and just, a lot of the early stuff from the late 60s and the early 70s. Black Sabbath was the melding of obviously like blues guitar greats like Eric Clapton's work with Cream and John Mayall and the Blues Breakers and Blue Cheer from San Francisco, and obviously Tony Iommi's distinct guitar sound, which was his guitar tuned down to D. He had 2 tips of his fingers cut off in a machine factory incident. And then just we talk about a regionality thing, especially you talk about how music for you is very regional. Tony Iommi and the members of Black Sabbath hail from Birmingham, England, which is a very industrial kind of like smoggy town outside of London, and it's very like grim and depressing, and it's just like, why would anybody want to be here? It's like one of those small towns you want to get out of. And I think a lot of that is reflected in the darkness in Black Sabbath's music. Nirvana, I mean, Kurt Cobain is a singular artist. I think his work transcends what he did with Nirvana. His views on politics and just the world in general, and just the trials and tribulations that he had to endure from being a janitor at the old high school he couldn't graduate out of to becoming a member and the primary member contributor to the biggest rock band of the early 90s prior to his suicide in 1994. A group I always loved. I just, whether it was melding influences from pop music to heavy metal to noise rock to punk music. It was like an amalgamation of everything that I loved that Kurt Cobain and co were able to encompass and embody so well. So my number 9 on my list is another oddity. It's My Bloody Valentine. They're a shoegaze act hailing from Dublin, Ireland. They only put out 3 records. Their seminal work is 1991's Loveless. I think it's one of the greatest records of all time. If I were to make a list, they'd probably be in my top 5. Shoegaze is a genre of music, obviously, that it's loud, distorted guitars, very low pitched vocals in the mix of recordings, and it's very ethereal sounding. I mean, like if you were to see a band in concert play shoegaze, and I've seen a couple of groups who incorporate elements of shoegaze live when I've been to concerts in the past, they tend to just stand there, but the music that they're playing gives off a more aggressive vibe, even though again at the same time it can be very ethereal. Than that the artists are presenting themselves on stage. I just think My Bloody Valentine, Kevin Shields, Belinda Butcher, Cole McCossick, Debbie Googe, the 4 primary members of that group, are the kings and queens, being that they're a multi-gender band, of embodying a sound that was pretty big. The scene that celebrated itself is what England would refer to shoegaze music in the early 1990s, and unfortunately it died out, but like all things do, I mean, most music scenes only tend to last for a couple of years anyway. But again, if anything, listen to the record Loveless. Their first album, Isn't Anything, is fantastic, and their follow-up 22 years later, MBV, is another phenomenal work that incorporates elements of dance music and hip-hop, and their discography is short, but it's flawless in my opinion. Number 8, and I've talked about this before on our Sports Exchange when I've talked about Zach Greinke as somebody who struggled with depression. This is an artist who I also have a piece coming out on the Tribune about that means a lot to me, and it's Nick Drake. Nick Drake was an English folk guitarist. Again, like My Bloody Valentine, a very short discography, though they're still active. He died tragically via suicide of an overdose of antidepressants in November of 1974, and it'll be 45 years next Monday, and we're going to celebrate that with an article that I have coming out on the South Florida Tribune that you can find under my contributor page. But Nick Drake's music embodied pastoral English folk music. It encompassed themes of melancholy and just social isolation. Like another artist that's next on this list, but I think the beauty of Nick Drake's music was not only the fact that he was a guitar player, but just the way in which he played. He employed a very unique finger picking style, which gives makes the chords that he plays very resonant. I mean, his last record, Pink Moon, which was released in early 1972, is just him, an acoustic guitar, and a slight piano coda that goes on the title track. But no, Nick Drake's music has, to put my masculinity at risk, it has reduced me to the verge of tears. But I feel like regardless of gender, music can do that to you if it hits you at the right time and place. And yeah, Nick Drake's music for me is something I could talk about all day. But all I would say is, definitely listen to his music, especially if you're the emotive type and you want to delve into themes of melancholy. Then he's somebody who, in a very poetic way, and he's Cambridge educated when he grew up in the late 60s. He's definitely somebody I would highly recommend. And I'll refer to it, my number 7 act is somebody I talked to on our first podcast, the Beach Boys. I mean, I talked about how their evolution from, writing surf and car songs in the early 60s to Brian Wilson, obviously his experimentation with psychedelic drugs and fully commencing with Pet Sounds and their lo-fi period of the late 60s and early 1970s. I think it's, the Beach Boys are I think in my opinion, there isn't a more seminal American act as far as I'm concerned. I think Brian Wilson, for the time that he was a fully contributing member of the Beach Boys, was an absolute genius. I thought he was brilliant. I thought he wrote some of the most beautiful songs of all time, obviously California Girls and Good Vibrations, his rendition of the Kingston Trio, Sloop John B. Brian Wilson was an absolute genius. I love the Beach Boys. I could talk about them all day, but I'll go to my number 6 pick, which is the Rolling Stones. I mean, the Rolling Stones did best what the Beatles couldn't do to their best of their ability, and that's melding, obviously, the dirty and the gritty American blues, obviously the Chicago and the Mississippi blues, with their brand of rock and roll influenced by Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and Little Richard and all those early forefathers of what we now know as rock and roll. The Stones did it best, obviously. You can point a record like Beggar's Banquet from 1968 after their brief foray into psychedelia with Between the Buttons, which I think is a fantastic, if not underrated, Rolling Stones record, and their Satanic Majesties, to their peak, what many consider their 2 best records, Sticky Fingers from 71 and Exile on Main Street, the big double album with 18 songs where they're, encompassing everything from jazz to rock to soul to R&B. I mean, the Rolling Stones are, in my opinion, the most important rock and roll band of all time. I don't think there's really any arguments about that. They're not my favorite band of all time, but the works that they have that are seminal are things to me that'll forever matter in my mind. And number 5 is a more modern act, and this will really further talk about the narrative of like a generation gap, and that's Australia's Tame Impala. Again, I'm somebody who loves strange music. I love experimental music. I love psychedelic music. Kevin Parker, who is the driving force in Tame Impala, they may tour as a band, but all the recording that goes on is merely him. He's writing, he's recording, he's producing and mixing everything on his own. I think Tame Impala is a revivalist act in many regards because their music tends to echo a lot of sentiments of like late 60s and early 70s progressive and psychedelic rock bands like the Beach Boys, obviously the Beatles psychedelic period, and don't go away, they're definitely going to be on this list at some point. But I think Kevin Parker is a genius. I think the way that he's able to bring emotion out of people who aren't even massive Tame Impala fans, there's a universality to a lot of the lyrical content of his songs and just the aesthetics of his music. I mean, obviously there's a lot of distortion going on there, but the way in which he's able to construct a song and put it together, and the perfectionist tendencies that he exudes into making sure that a Tame Impala record is unique from everything else around it, is something that I appreciate. I think Kevin Parker, I got a chance to see Tame Impala in May of this year, and it was one of the more religious experiences for somebody who's not really a religious person himself. I definitely felt a higher power when I was in the company of Kevin Parker and his lads from Australia. And number 4 on my list, an act who I have loved for as long as I can remember, really fully getting into immersing myself in their catalog when I entered high school, and that's Pink Floyd. Everybody knows who Pink Floyd is, whether you're talking about the experimental stuff from the 60s when Syd Barrett, their founding member and lead songwriter who took an overabundance of psychedelic drugs, found himself, on the throes of schizophrenia and not being a functioning musician. At that point, he couldn't record. I mean, they had to kick him out of the band, and they experimented, but then they a lot of that experimentation culminated in records like Metal or Dark Side of the Moon, which everybody knows. I'm sure, Scott, maybe you're not the biggest Pink Floyd fan, but if I showed you the prism with the rainbow hologram going through it, you know exactly what that is. You would know that's Pink Floyd, and that's just one of the beauties of Pink Floyd's music. Obviously, Wish You Were Here, their record, an ode to Syd Barrett. I mean, Pink Floyd have been with me in some of the most formative times of my life, and they're a group that I'll probably always return to, even if I'm not a big fan of their 80s catalog and it's brief. I'm just, I'm not too crazy about it. Records like Dark Side of the Moon, Animals, Metal, The Wall, they're albums that I'm going to love forever, and till the day I die, I'll be an ardent Pink Floyd fan. And number 3 is another modern act, although they got their start in the mid-90s, and that's Radiohead. Radiohead, for me, I love artists who can embrace various, sounds, and Radiohead did that from their grunge to alternative rock, starting with influence from the Pixies to embracing sounds of like REM and pop music and the Beach Boys and the Beatles, and further experimenting with elements of electronic music, jazz, 20th century classical music. My favorite album of all time, if we ever get into it, and I'll just say it now, is Radiohead's 2000 record Kid A. I think it's one of the it's the biggest middle finger to rock music since Nirvana's In Utero in 1993, where it's just a revolt against a lot of what public had expected for them to do after arguably one of the biggest records of their career in OK Computer. And that's another record that I feel is one of the best of all time. I think it's critically and commercially lauded. I just think that album encompasses so many different emotions, themes of paranoia, depression, isolation, and just the ever-growing technology environment of the world around us. And I think themes that are just as relevant today as they were when that record came out in 1997. Number 2 is a band that for a long time I said was my favorite, and that's Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin obviously formed out of the ashes of the Yardbirds, of Jimmy Page being their guitarist for 2 years from 66 to 68, to Robert Plant coming along and giving, singing songs about, distant lands of, the Tolkienverse, and, writing epics like Stairway to Heaven, John Bottom's explosive grenade-like drum style, John Paul Jones' multi-instrumental abilities, and Jimmy Page being, showing us a blues guitar player who wasn't afraid to get dirty. I mean, when I listen to a Led Zeppelin song, I feel like I'm running through the mud. I mean, that's the dirty, gritty aesthetic of their music. And the same way that the Stones were. I think they were just part of my language, they were just two badass rock bands that, they put themselves in the pantheon of great rock groups and musical artists because they weren't afraid to be themselves and embrace sounds of cultures distant from their own. And with that, I get to my number 1, and I feel like I rambled a little bit, but it's anticlimactic. You check any list for greatest artists of all time, and they're going to be number 1, but that sentiment is shared with me, and it's the Beatles. I love the Beatles more than any other musical artist I could ever imagine to name. I just think what they did in a 7-year recording period, starting with the implementation of Ringo on drums in 1962 to culminating with Abbey Road, the last recorded record in 1969. I think the Beatles are the most important. They're the most singular, the most critically and commercially acclaimed. They're the biggest selling musical act of all time. I think there's never been, and I feel like I'm going to eventually write a piece about this because in recent days I've been further immersing myself in their catalog in preparation for this podcast, and just to reaffirm my love for, I think, the most important thing that music has ever given us, and that's John Paul, George, and Ringo. I think, Robin Hitchcock, who was a famous indie musician who was in a band called UMI, said it best, that the Beatles were the amalgamation of 4 colors, and when those 4 colors mixed together, you got something that was so unique unto its own that it couldn't be replicated in any respects. Even with as many imitators as there will never be another foursome quite like that. I mean, you could talk about the Braves pitching rotation in the 90s if you want to get sports with it, but the Beatles, I think, are the biggest cultural cornerstone that has ever existed. I think the image of them walking across Abbey Road, obviously in 1969, that crosswalk by the studios down in London, is one of the most iconic photographs ever taken, whether or not you're a music fan or not. That image is something that's ingrained in our minds, whether or not it's in front of us or not. And then obviously Lennon-McCartney, the most prolific and most acclaimed songwriting partnership there ever was. Obviously they gave us songs like Hey Jude and Yesterday, which is a Paul McCartney composition, A Day in the Life, I Love Me Do, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Hard Day's Night, Can't Buy Me Love, 8 Days a Week. Like, I could sit here for days and hours on end and talk about what makes the Beatles so beautiful, but in my opinion, I just think the transcendence of their music across, fathers and sons and grandfathers and, mothers and daughters, and there's a universality, and that's a word I've used already, but there's a universality with the Beatles music that I don't think you can find in most other artists. I mean, not only were they able to experiment with everything from pop to country to folk to jazz to even the avant-garde, they did it in a way that just seemed so uniquely them, and I don't think you get that with a lot of other artists. I mean, for me, they're the greatest musical act of all time. They're the greatest artists, respectively, of all time. There's never going to be anybody like them, and, if somebody's going to ask me who's my favorite musical artist, it's the Beatles, because their influence can't be denied, and there's nobody like them, and I don't ever get goosebumps the way I do listening to a Beatles song than I would with another artist. So, yeah, that's my list. I mean,
all right, now I get to talk. That's okay.
Go ahead.
That's all right. I'm just kidding with you. Really, just kidding with you. being a Detroiter, obviously we have a lot of things in the Motown sound with Michael Jackson, and I think Aretha Franklin